Good afternoon, good evening, bonjour, bonsoir, dopaha ke namaste, sham ke namaste. I welcome you to this INHAF webinar, Humanitarian Architecture, Why is it relevant in a post-COVID world? It is the first of two sessions. The second is tomorrow night, led by my colleague Sandra, Shelter, Protection and Gender, 6 stories of female architects designing for women and children. My name is Esther Charlesworth, and I'm a professor in architecture at RMIT, where I established the Master of Disaster Design and Development, or MOD degree, and I'm also the founding director of Architects Without Frontiers. I might just request, Radhika, there's some background noise happening there. Okay, I'll just keep speaking. So, as we speak in Australia, extreme flooding across Eastern Australia is wreaking havoc on communities and buildings across a land size similar to Alaska. In Greece, refugees are camping in dry stream beds at risk from fires and floods. Camp residents organise their own housing, water supply and sanitation in completely tragic ways. In Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh just today, many camps were destroyed by fire, with more than, I think now, 80,000 people losing their homes and livelihoods. In India, over the last 2 decades, the country has faced a number of disasters, including the tsunami, earthquakes, floods and cyclones. These have resulted also in widespread loss of life and loss of public and private property. So my question tonight is, what is the role of designers, architects and built environment professionals amidst such global flux and tragedy? This is the theme tonight, and I think it will also permeate through the theme of tomorrow's session, again led by Sandra, on shelter, protection and gender. My 2014 book, Humanitarian Architecture, explored these themes through analysing the expanding role for architects in designing projects for communities after the event of natural or man-made disasters. The 15 case studies featured in the body of the book, including many from guests tonight, including Kirtee, Sandra, Brett and Eric, illustrated how architects can use their spatial sensibility and integrated problem-solving skills to help alleviate both human and natural disasters. But now, in 2021, these same issues of how design can address the big global challenges of our time, from poverty to pandemics to fires and floods, is more pressing than ever. So tonight, I will moderate a conversation between our 5 speakers here. First of all, Sandra, who I met working in Mostar in Bosnia right at the start of our careers and our immersion into this world of design, disaster and development. Sandra is an architect with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, or IFRC. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Eric Cesal, who's a great friend, architect, writer, works with the Curry Stone Prize. He's a professor at Berkeley, and he formerly was also with Architecture for Humanity. Brett Moore, another great friend from Australia, is an architect and currently Chief of Shelter and Settlements for UNHCR. Jane Rothschild, a long friendship through Architects Without Frontiers. Jane then established the Anganwadi project, and she'll be talking about that tonight. Jane is based in Sydney. And lastly, thanks to Kirtee Shah, President of INHAF, a great friend, and I'll ask Kirtee to follow up with a few introductory comments after mine. So just to tell you how the session is going to work in the next 45 minutes or an hour, to give you a roadmap. So I will be directing questions to each of our 5 speakers and moderating a conversation. and then we will open the questions to the general public. Now, you need to put those questions in the Q&A function. We won't be answering those questions during the actual webinar, but we will attempt to answer them afterwards. And just be cognizant, it's 10 o'clock in Melbourne, so Jane and I are a little bit sleepy. It's 4 a.m. for Eric in Berkeley. So if we don't last the whole distance, excuse us. And Jane and Brett, no doubt, Sandra and Brett are in the middle of a work day. Welcome to all of our friends through INHAF. And again, thanks so much to Kirtee and Radhika and Shah for pulling together this amazing series and for the opportunity just to be part of it. So Kirtee, I'm just going to hand over to you for a couple of minutes to introduce, and then we will go into the questions.
Thank you, Professor Charlesworth. What I intend doing in 2 minutes that I have is to really bring in an additional perspective to this whole meeting, besides what Professor Charlesworth pointed out. And that is this, that in India, in fact, in much of South Asia, humanitarian architecture is not only getting engaged in post-disaster reconstruction, means helping and providing skills and services for rehabilitation of people affected by floods, earthquakes, tsunami, etc., is obviously needed. But there is something more which is needed as well. And that is this, that we don't have this earthquakes and tsunamis come occasionally, they're episodic. We have a perpetual ongoing kind of disasters happening in several forms. And I thought I very quickly mention in order to kind of bring out why we require community architects to work on this. Look at homelessness, people who are in pavements, people who are, I think, on construction sites, migrant laborers. We had anywhere between 40 to 100 million of them in our cities. If you're talking about slums, we have 70 million people in our slums. 80% of our housing deficit, urban housing deficit, which is put at 18.4 million units, is because of overcrowding. And then we are building 30 million houses in our villages in order to take care of the homelessness problem that we have. And therefore, it's not only, I think, having, community architects or humanitarian architects who look after the earthquakes and disasters, but we essentially need architects to look after these issues as well. One small little point that I'd like to make is this. And unfortunately, the way things are, they're not available as they are needed. This country built 30 million houses under what is called Indira Awas Yojana for the rural poor. This happened over a period of 25, 30 years. Government admits that 50% of the units didn't reach people. They require interventions, they require correctives. Architects in this country didn't even know that such a project existed. And one could really go on. We at the moment are building something like 20 million houses in the urban areas, require architects' role, involvement, contribution is not really happening as one would like. So the point that one is making is this, that while we're looking at community architecture, when we're looking at, humanitarian architecture, our need is ongoing. We require a large number of these people to come in and intervene and help. So this is an additional dimension that I would like to kind of bring in while we discuss the role of community architects or humanitarian architects in the context of India and other South Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirtee. So we're going to get stuck into it now because we have such a depth of experiences here, of projects, of people from so many continents, that I really want to give the floor to them and then over to you, the audience. So I'm going to start off with Eric. So Eric, tell me how you came to work in the humanitarian and development sector. Now you've got 2 minutes and I'm counting.
I also set a timer. How did I come to work in this sector? Via a path that I found to be very, very common as I've become a part of this field and met many similar architects across the world. I started off in commercial architecture, doing what a lot of architects do, designing hotels and banks and condos for rich people and that sort of thing, and found it deeply unsatisfying. As an undergrad, I was seduced into the idea that architecture could change the world. That's why I got into it, because I saw these sort of vast possibilities within it, and didn't find the resolution of those possibilities in my commercial work. So I went back to graduate school, hoping that that might alleviate it somehow and might re-inspire me. And it kind of did the opposite. I mean, sounds like most people here have been to architecture school. You spend a lot of time sitting around wondering why a brick wants to be a brick and things like that. And yeah, I mean, I was on the cusp of giving up, of doing something completely different. And Katrina happened. Hurricane Katrina struck the United States. And like a million of my countrymen, I went down to volunteer my services and didn't have much of a plan, but went down and began helping with a couple of different organizations down there and met some really extraordinary people. And at that point in my career, I felt I knew a lot of what architecture was about and how to do it in terms of the technical ongoings of architecture. But I think it was the first time in my life that I realized what architecture was for. It's for people. It's to make people's lives better. And it completely changed my understanding of the built environment and what it provides. Disasters, I think, give you a lens into the necessity of architecture that you can't necessarily find in a non-disaster context. So that's how I came to be here.
Thank you, Eric. And Sandra, over to you. What was the pathway that led you into working for the Ifrc?
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, everyone. Thrilled to be here. Let me start by saying I grew up in a family in which giving back to society was somehow believed as being very important. I think we had an open house policy way before the free Airbnb even existed for migrants, asylum seekers. My mom was with Amnesty International and my father was a pioneer at EU, but coming himself from a very poor, impoverished environment. So I chose to study architecture in Rome, believing exactly this, the importance of humanitarian architecture as an application of these ethics into my work. Or in other words, architecture as a service, as an art that produces things that matter, things that are needed. And before I did a master's in Barcelona those days, I chose to travel the world, and I did a solo travel of 3 continents, 4 months, and touched somehow firsthand the inequalities, the unmeasurable needs in the aftermath of the Balkan War or of the East Asian tsunami. So that's where I decided that it was time for myself to embark in humanitarian work. I started to enroll with a small NGO in Paris, but then gradually grew into Oxfam and the Red Cross as being our larger scale organizations in conflict and in disaster settings. So somehow I had finally found my way to combine my lust for social engagement, the appetite to travel, and ultimately also put my design thinking at work. That's how I got there.
Thank you, Sandra. Now over to Brett. Brett, I believe you studied architecture in my hometown, Melbourne. So what's been your journey now to this incredible responsibility as the Chief of Shelter and Settlements with UNHCR?
Thanks, Esther. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks to the panelists and INHAF as well for hosting the event. I think all of our paths were somewhat circuitous, and mine is also the same. I grew up on a farm in rural Australia, and we were always outdoors doing things and making things. And I chose architecture because I was interested in the production of the built environment, but not really knowing much more than that. And soon after finishing, a little bit like Eric mentioned, I worked with a small firm in Melbourne, and then, I got a little disenchanted with building big houses for rich people. But earlier than that, I'd started traveling, and I started traveling as a backpacker, low budget. In 1990, end of 1991, in fact, one of the first trips I had was to India for 3 months. And that really exposed me to the lives of many people that were very different from mine. And I started thinking a lot more around what was my social responsibility in trying to give something back to this world and trying to improve the lives of people who were living in poor conditions. My travels took me to many other countries. And by the time I finished several years of architecture school and then working, I started a volunteer program in the late 90s in Vietnam. And that really was the beginning of the departure for me from conventional architecture. And then one thing really followed another. I'd like to say I didn't really have a pathway. I just kind of started stumbling, and I'd go from one job to another and enjoy what I was doing. And I always really wanted to do something that made me feel effective. So after about 20 years and working in many different countries, I've now ended up in Geneva working with UNHCR, and this is another turn in my life where I'm working more at the kind of program management level, but really in an organization like this, we're focused on refugees, and refugees mostly in conflict-related contexts. So we have both the internal work and then the coordination with all the partners. Naturally, the work these days is preoccupied with Syria, with many places in Africa. I recently returned from 3 months in Lebanon. So we have a strong focus on working conflict contexts, which has its own particular challenges, because often there's no real end to the conflict, and people's lives are really destroyed and their ability to recover is really limited. But in the end, we're dealing with people and we're dealing with basic human conditions. It doesn't matter whether it's a natural disaster or a conflict, we still have to give people a really basic but fundamental place from which they can rebuild their lives. And that essential humanitarian element is what really still keeps me with this work. So thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Brett. Now over to you, Kirtee. We can't hear you. You have to turn on your, while we get Kirtee back on. Yep, we can hear you now. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello.
All good. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. No, there are 3 factors which played a big role in my walking into this particular vocation. First was my upbringing in a very small village in India. I grew up in a village till I was 17 years old. And the first time I ever dialed a telephone, I was that age. Second was I grew up at the age of 22. She was almost illiterate, but taught me values. She said it's very important to become a good person, a good human being. So this was the first major influence. As a matter of fact, I go on saying that I understand development almost intuitively because I lived in the villages and because I knew what poverty is all about. My second major influence was School of Architecture, Ahmedabad, where I studied. It was a liberal value school, progressive outlook, questioning attitude, emphasis on learning while doing, and environment of freedom. And this allowed us to think. And that thinking led to something very interesting. Very early in my career, we started asking questions about architecture profession in this country. And we found out almost in no time that it was highly elitist, that architects work largely and mainly for the rich and the power elite. They work almost exclusively in cities. Villages, 638,000 didn't exist for them. Their issues didn't exist for them. There was a complete blackout from the rural world, and there was disconnect from what one understood to be the major social and societal challenges. And I thought this was not the kind of architecture I wanted to do. I said, this is not the kind of architect I wanted to become. And therefore, just 4 months left to get my degree, I dropped out and went to villages. Fortunately, went to villages which were destroyed by floods. Took a responsibility to build a whole village, which was destroyed with other colleagues. And therefore, my first assignment was not very small. It was 750 houses, 84-acre site, government of Gujarat as the client, design, community work. And of course, we organized large number of students camps where people came here and built first 365 houses for the disaster victims. After I came back after a year and a half, set up a non-profit called Ahmedabad Study Action Group with other people, which I still run after 50 years. And though I've done many other things, I still remain largely involved and committed to this work. So that was the whole thing.
Thank you, Kirtee. Now, I'm going to next go to Jane, but Jane, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you 2 questions. So,
okay.
Jane, how did you get to start the Anganwadi project? And secondly, how have the projects of TAP or the Anganwadi project been affected by the pandemic in the last 14 months?
Okay, great. It seems like there's such a common thread between all of us who ended up in this kind of work. So I grew up in New York and I studied literature before I came to architecture, and then I moved to Sydney. And like many others, I was in practice doing high-end residential design, which I found fairly unsatisfying. But for me, the catalyst really was the 2004 tsunami. And I just remember reading, sitting, looking at the news and seeing doctors and engineers and all these people who are able to actually contribute so much in this disaster, and wondering why it was that there was absolutely no avenue for architects to be involved in this reconstruction. So I just sort of began looking for opportunities and ways to get involved in this kind of work. So probably the first was I traveled with Habitat for Humanity and went up to Banda Aceh. And sort of saw firsthand some of the development work that was going up there, and then continued working with Habitat in Vietnam. So that was sort of the first thing. And then the second was joining Architects Without Frontiers, where I met you, Esther, because that was really at the time in Sydney or in Australia, it seemed like it was the only kind of, really the only kind of organization that was working in the humanitarian sector at that point. So through AWF, I was actually, it was this sort of fluke event where I was giving a talk, and I met the woman who was a designer who I ended up starting the Anganwadi project with. And we began chatting, and she'd been working in Ahmedabad, Kirtee, in the Anganwadis doing designs, and had seen how these little preschools were such bad conditions. So we began chatting, and I realized I had access to architects. And so we thought, let's go to India together. And that was really how our first Anganwadi started. And now sort of 14 years later, we've done 19 of these little schools. So again, like many of the others, it was definitely not a clear path, but it was really, a series of different events and kind of good chance, encounters probably. Oh, sorry, Esther, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Jane. So just sort of, just tell us about the last 12 months and the challenges faced by working in the environment of the pandemic where your volunteers can't go on site, and how it's affected your projects in any good or bad ways.
Yeah, obviously, like many other organizations, COVID had an enormous immediate impact. We had 2 teams of volunteer architects in India, one in Ahmedabad and one down in Andhra Pradesh in a rural area. And it sort of became more and more aware to us that things were getting quite dire. So we ended up having to recall our volunteers back to Australia in the middle of the projects. And also, the communities that we work with were really badly affected. So whether it was the rural sector or the you know, the day workers who we worked with in the slums in Ahmedabad were extremely badly affected because they're rickshaw drivers and they're the people who actually collect the garbage on the streets. So they had no more access to income. So we watched from afar, seeing these communities we worked so closely with being under this incredibly difficult situation. But the benefits that we then, which we saw, were actually trying to adapt to this situation. So we ended up having to find a way to work differently. So our volunteers came back to Australia, but they started working remotely with a local architect in Andhra Pradesh. And so once the building sites were actually then opened up, we actually managed to finish a school. And we worked out that, in fact, working this way was actually really effective and probably better. And so that's changed the way that we've worked, and now decided that we don't necessarily have to have volunteers from Australia on the ground in India, but we can actually kind of create a new kind of working relationship. And I think the other really interesting benefit we've had was that because everyone was locked down and glued to their computers, we've been contacted by some amazing organizations in India. And so a whole bunch of new really exciting collaborations have opened up to us, which we weren't really expecting, from, you know, ministries in Delhi to the Aga Khan Foundation to, you know, the education departments in Andhra Pradesh. So whereas we're such a small project and, you know, do 1 or 2 schools a year, suddenly through contacts through the pandemic, it's actually completely changed how we want to work and, you know, start working more in kind of a mentoring role and kind of expand our reach.
Thank you, Jane. Now I'm going to hand back to Brett here for a moment. Now, Brett, as I understand, your last year has been a cascading series of working on disasters. You had your normal work with UNHCR, and then you spent, was it 3 months in Beirut after the bomb blast, and the series of ongoing disasters that beset Lebanon, as well as pandemic. And do you want to just talk to us about how do you deal with just this stuff that keeps on coming?
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, I mean, we've all had a really challenging year. For me, in the beginning, and like many of us who are working from home, you know, we thought it would last a month, and then it was another month, and then another month. So it really kind of went on and on. And as we've now seen, the situation in different countries has evolved quite differently. You're in the fortunate position of being in Australia, where life is reasonably back to normal. And as you know, I was there for a few months over Christmas, but now I'm back here. We're back into the same situation of working from home as the case numbers rise in Europe again. So we've had to really adjust the way we work. Now, it's made us think really deeply around how relevant it was to even work in the way that we used to. And I think Jane touched on that in what she was just mentioning as well. So we were really notorious for operating through this process where we would go on what we call field missions, which was going to another country where the issues were, where the conflict was, where the disaster is, and going there to help prepare, or to help respond, or to help recover, and sometimes a little bit of all of that. So the nature of our work has changed a lot. The flip side is that, of course, what it means is that much more investment, trust, and implementation has been placed in the field teams because of the inability to fly internationally. As insofar as this relates to the example of Lebanon, I mean, I was in the interesting situation where that was that window period in the European summer last year where things were on the improvement, and a bit more access to get out of Europe and get to the countries of operation actually occurred. So I went to Lebanon initially for 6 weeks to help coordinate UNHCR's response and also help coordinate the overall approach with the government and others, including the World Bank. So it was a very interesting process there. The context of Lebanon, as you know well, Esther, really is one where it's you know, very able and sophisticated construction industry, a highly motivated and cultured civil society. So nobody was waiting on the humanitarians to respond. People were out there doing things right from the beginning. But the real struggle was the impact of the blast in Beirut over a disastrous economy, which since November of the previous year had basically collapsed. The Lebanese pound had lost 80 to 90% of its value. COVID had already kicked in by March of last year, and a lot of people lost their jobs, same as in many, many countries. So there were these compounding impacts, economic impacts, which really exacerbated the effect of the blast. There was around 77,000 apartments that were damaged. So a whole lot of actors, from humanitarians, from people themselves, religious and faith groups, private sector, they all kind of joined up and really responded. We're left with a funny situation now. I mean, in fact, just before this session, I was on a meeting with Lebanon. We've been trying to work through with the World Bank and what's called a reform, recovery, reconstruction framework to really, direct the next 2 to 3 years of recovery. The most basic and essential humanitarian work has been done. People who are living in heavily damaged houses, they've had a basic repair, but the heavy damage and the damage to the cultural heritage of Lebanon is really significant, and that has been left unattended. Too expensive, too hard. I know people in India have seen this in many occasions, and many other countries as well, where the simple and most basic life-saving repairs happen, and then the complicated long-term recovery task really is often left unattended. So we're really in that very critical moment these days.
Thank you, Brett. Eric, now I'm going to ask you a curly one, but I've written so much about this. So in your great book, which I put on the chat thing here, Down Detour Road, which was very inspirational for me, which was a fundamental critique of the discipline, of the way we were trained and everything else. But Eric, so this interface between COVID, design and disaster, are we trained for any of this stuff in design education? How do you see this? I mean, will the pandemic make us kind of get out of the pyramid capital A mode or not? You there, Eric?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Are we trained for this? Not really, but sort of. For the audience, I also have a reputation of being a serial optimist, but I think, one of the things that COVID is going to reveal is the enhanced necessity for what we do. When people ask me about what I do and, being a disaster architect, I often morbidly comment that, 20 years from now, every architect's going to be a disaster architect, and, we're just ahead of the curve. I think COVID has brought to light the possibility of a global disaster, of a multinational disaster in a way that few disasters have. And it creates a forum, I think, for cooperation and for intersection. Logistically, I mean, to Brett's comments, it's made everything more complicated. It's much harder to do work. But one of the things that I've always commented about disaster work and humanitarian work is that the limitation of resources and logistics forces a kind of creativity that I think architects are trained at. We're trained to be creative. We're trained to think at scale. We're trained to think in nonlinear fashion. And then regrettably, most of us get into some kind of commercial practice where we have to set that aside and just kind of do very routine things for the sake of the market. I think humanitarian work gives architects that opportunity to return to a kind of innovation and creativity, and the world needs it now. I think COVID shows us the vulnerability of our global public health system. It shows us the vulnerability of global infrastructure, and it shows perhaps to a wider audience the precarity with which much of humanity lives. So yes, I think there's a wonderful and expansive role for architects, and I look forward to seeing what we can do with it.
Thank you, Eric. Now over to you, Sandra. So Sandra, you've spent the last 12, 14 months, a lot of it working from home. 3 kids running around like so many other people, probably not in the field as much as you're used to. I mean, how have you found this adjustment in your work? sort of day-to-day, the day-to-day machinations of getting things done when you can't actually be in the field.
Yes, you touched exactly the point that last year, it has been a year, yeah, things have impacted quite a bit, both personally, I guess, and professionally. And also, I guess these two spheres are no longer that separate. There's a lot of blurry lines there between personal life and I would say if it's already hard, usually juggling between finding balance between humanitarian work, that takes me as well, usually traveling a lot with 3 kids at home just now. We need to adjust to new routines the whole time. So yes, I'm still dealing with a 6 p.m. curfew these days here. A lot is happening and changing by the week. So that's constant adjustment these days, and it has been. We are usually very heavily reliant on travels, as the colleague said as well, because we just do so much of on-the-job trainings in the global South and the Red Cross work. We do have always counterparts. I must say that I was already reliant a lot on the teams on the ground. The Red Cross teams who would be asking our services are also the ones that are there from day one. So when it comes to, of course, adjusting a lot of the co-design work that we're doing, or the participatory approaches that we're trying to implement, that sometimes cannot happen in front of a screen. Sometimes that has been taking a lot of adjustment to still allow these immersive experiences, or at least the training from a distance. So I think on one side, I mean, I found it a bit difficult these days because this life in 2 dimensions, the shrinking space for social interaction is taking its toll. But on the flip side, as we said, it is that the fact that we've lowered the threshold so much that we can basically these days join from anywhere, any initiative that is for us important as well. And cutting on travel budgets is unprecedented. So of course, we're still missing the interaction, but there is so much more that we can participate in potentially as well. So that is fascinating. Now, when it comes to response side, and I'd like to point the angle to something which I'm seeing throughout. It's not specific to a country, but we're seeing the devastating effects, not just, of course, my colleagues that are the health, primary health takers, maybe within the Red Cross, but the immediate impact of the pandemic is not just the health one or the mental health part. It is now the socioeconomic impact, and the fact that that's no longer a side effect. It's not the kind of collateral damage. It is a slow erosion of hard to win rights in the housing sector, for instance. And yes, we've said that housing was the front line against, as long as you could isolate, as long as you had access to basic services. But what we're seeing now, year 2 and these last months, is that people just simply cannot afford their rents anymore. Kirtee mentioned homelessness. I'm looking at rental support as one of the primary entry points now into protecting people, women that are exposed to violence at home, so they're even trapped at home, and allowing them to come up, to be somewhere else and to be protected is fundamental. So what we're trying to do within the Red Cross is to look at non-conventional ways. Maybe don't call them, it's difficult to call them humanitarian or not, or COVID related. We're just simply advocating and to authorities to find innovative ways to secure shelter for the poorest group that we're seeing. The last point I want to make here is that, yes, disasters haven't stopped. Sometimes we know it's COVID is just simply down the line of the many risks that people are exposed to. And that's where the pandemic / humanitarian or developmental issues cannot be dissected or put into boxes. That's for us an easy way to put maybe the streams with funding, but when it comes down to the ground, it's just not working. So we need to look at the interactions there. I said it yesterday in another call. I mean, you cannot ask a child living in an unfinished substandard building in Beirut, whose single mom has just lost her job in the informal market, and whose house maybe cannot be fixed just simply because she has no tenure rights. Does he need, or his need, more humanitarian or developmental or conditions to COVID? That would be just simply morally unacceptable or short-sighted, to say the least. So what we're advocating here is really to tackle the matter seriously. There's no silver bullet. What we must do is looking at shelter and the housing sector and how are these both affected, and find new entry points that have an impact on people's life, be it now, in the mid or the longer run is what matters.
Thank you, Sandra. And just while we're on this same theme, Kirtee, what have been your experiences in the last 12 or 14 months with everything that you're doing in terms of the impact of the pandemic, good and bad? You need to unpress mute.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think, this pandemic has been incredible in a number of ways. First thing, it really made me realize what can happen and how vulnerable we are as people, as societies, as civilization. You just couldn't believe that the country of size of India is 638,000 villages, almost 1,400 million people, 8,000, 9,000 cities, and $2.9 trillion economy got shut down with a notice of 4 hours. My understanding was this, that if you wanted to kind of shut your home for 15 days, if you're going out, it will require more time. But it happened. And it's just changed my understanding of what can happen. And I think that was very, very important. Second thing is this, that, in my long career, I worked on all kind of calamities, worked on flood, earthquake, tsunami, war, industrial disaster, cyclone, ethnic crisis, conflict, riots, all kind of things. This was very different, in terms of what it is and what one could do. And I think, in the process, in my understanding, I think, not only I think one's response has changed, one has changed internally in terms of what one does, because one has been involved in this for 50 years. And this is work which, while you do things, it also changes you, make you a different person. So this is a new challenge that came up. What I did was this, what I learned was this. I used to, for the last 30 years, I travel 15 days a month. Last year, almost, I've not traveled for a day, and it's acceptable, it's workable. Learned to work from home, which was never done before. Learned to kind of use technology. We organized this 45 to today the 45th webinar, trying to kind of involve large number of people, not only from the country and the world. And we picked up a topic which we thought was very relevant in the context of COVID, because urbanization and cities really require to be rethought. And we were very lucky to get this organized and find as many as 250 people across the country in the last 8 or 9 months to come and talk with us as we are doing today. So that was very important. What also was very important was the kind of work we did this time. Like, say, when I started 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we used to work directly with the poor. In the last 30 years, your policies, your programs, your design, you're not working directly with the poor. This time it happened. We first got organized in Ahmedabad city. We had about, 8 partners, raised almost 5 million rupees, and got involved into helping large number of people on food, on travel, and things like this. My colleagues who are working in Pune, they did immensely interesting work in terms of not only raising money, but helping migrant labor who wanted to go home, help them go home, and in the process, work with partners we never thought we would work. Like, say, we work with transgender, a whole community of them become partners and played very important role, and we understood what kind of people they are. And therefore, I think, it has been a remarkable journey of 1 year, learning and doing things. And last thing that I would like to mention is this, that this particular calamity, this response to it has brought climate change nearer to us in the sense that, oh, it can happen. It's not something, which people talk about. It's not something, that one should worry about. It is something no one ever thought COVID would happen. Similarly, climate change probably is on upon us, and I think we've got to be prepared for that. So understanding of how you deal with it, new understanding of development challenges, new understanding of role that you could play, and environment within which you could operate. At the age of 78, you don't really have much time to think about life and living and relationship, work and future. Believe me, I'm thinking fresh about future at 78. I still tell myself that I must find 10, 15 years, more years to work and do as actively as I do, because there's so much to do.
Kirtee, you're young.
78,
My mother is 95 and out there probably watching this webinar. So there's hope for us all yet. So just in moving towards a sort of final question here that I'll put to our panelists before we end up with the last 15 or 20 minutes in questions. And sorry, we probably won't get through everyone's questions, and some of the questions maybe are more sort of general statements and questions, but we'll try to tackle those as best we can. So just Jane and Sandra, so what advice would you give to a young designer, an architect, an industrial designer, an engineer, landscape architect who wants to work in this field, either for an organization like the Ifrc or eventually start up their own NGO like Jane has done? So maybe Sandra, to you first and then to Jane.
Yes, that's a good question, and I suppose I hope that there is a varied audience today, which is both a new generation or maybe just simply also adults that want a change in their career path. So maybe what I'd like to say is keep on questioning a bit the status quo of the business or predefined, career paths that you're meant to be in. There are options out there, and the need for architects, designer, planners, name it up, is just unprecedented, as we say today. So just try to get out of your comfort zones, but also listen to what are your chords. I mean, what is the interest and knowledge you're most inclined to work in? Is it because you come from an urban career path and you've studied public space and that's what drives you? Great. Climate action and environmental impact or environmental architecture is something that drives you, absolutely. Or study and research around materials. That's something that we, low-cost building technologies, we need all of these skill sets. So that's where you can tackle it first from so many different ways. So you don't have to either choose an either or, quit what you're doing now and dive deep into humanitarian. What you can do also is really look at doing work and serve in your own neighborhoods. I don't say the backyard, but anyhow, within neighborhoods, look at poverty pockets, look at people that have needs for better designs on specific matters, or the target groups that we mentioned before, migrant workers, asylum seekers, improving the spaces where they're living in. So I don't think that it has to be an either or choice, especially I'm seeing more and more people that are able to keep to some extent their practices and then, get assignments with some of our organizations, consultancy work, or support us as advanced interns in the beginning and grow into this more slowly. Me, myself, I wouldn't send someone that hasn't had that exposure to, help us in Afghanistan or in very complex settings. It doesn't have to be that far. What I'd also just like to highlight is that for more and more women, of course, women architects and planners, we see that there's a growing momentum there. I'm just really happy to say that, because although the humanitarian architecture is still not mainstreamed, will it be in the future? Who knows? But definitely the sector is also very much male dominated. And I'd like to say that the fact that we are trying to expand a network that envisages stronger collaboration, advice, support each other in finding ways to do more together, also as women in this architecture profession, is something that highly motivates me. So that's where there is a call for action as well for the audience out there who are female designers, architects, and yeah, also maybe join us tomorrow, because more stories of journeys on women that will take us from West to East Africa, from Lebanon to Bangladesh. I think that's where we need to keep finger crossed and eyes and ears wide open.
Thank you, Sandra. Now, Jane, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Sandra has been saying as well. But I guess for me, I think it's, really don't be afraid to start small. And that, if you keep putting one foot in front of the other and you're persistent and you follow your passions, from very small things, much larger things can grow, which has kind of been our experience, where we started in a very small way and things have just progressively gotten bigger and more interesting. And I guess also, having done this project for a while, I think architects tend to come into these projects with kind of preconceived ideas of doing these beautiful kind of humanitarian bamboo structures. And through time, what we've really realized that it's really not about the building, and it's not about architecture in the way that we're taught to practice architecture in school, but really, I think in this kind of situation, your best skill and your best ability is being able to listen and to sit down, and actually the solutions come from listening to the people that you're actually working with. So for us, it's become so much less about the building and architecture, and so much more about the community engagement process and the empowerment of people who've been involved in that process. And I suppose also, leading on from what Sandra said about women in design and humanitarian architecture, for some reason, most of our volunteer architects who give up 6 months of their life to go work in India are women. And, having been involved in this project, which is, very small, building Anganwadis, they've gone on to careers, as Esther, you would well know, working in the Red Cross, doing, studying Master of Disaster and Design. So you can start small with these projects, and you just really don't know where that's going to take you.
Thank you, Jane. Now I'm going to hand over to Eric and Brett and just put a question to both of you. What would have been the one thing in you both studied architecture 20, 25 years ago? Don't think you're as old as me, where it's into the 3 decades. What is the one thing that you wish you'd learnt in your design education that would have prepared you for the work that you're doing now? Maybe Eric and then Brett, all together.
Sure. Actually, I think Jane put it perfectly. I wish I had learned listening. Architecture school is so self-obsessed, where you kind of sit around, you don't really care about anybody's opinion except maybe your studio professors or something like that. And that aspect of talking to people and trying to understand them and their lives is not really part of the process. Even to the extent that you do some sort of site research in the course of a studio project, you go there for 2 hours and kind of look around and take some pictures and this sort of thing. And I think it inculcates in young architects an idea that that's how architecture works, that, our function is just to leverage our imagination and kind of think up these ideas. And Jane, I've had a similar experience. When architects sign up to do humanitarian work, they've already got all the solutions, and they don't know where they're going or who they're working for, but they've got the solution already pre-baked. And I think that unlearning some of that stuff and changing our educational paradigms so that, center more around the art of asking questions and actually hearing the answers would do a lot to change the field.
Thank you, Eric. Brett.
Yeah, I think the question's been also, tackled by the panelists. On the one hand, we shouldn't strive to define humanitarian architecture and non-humanitarian architecture. There is an architecture of humanity, isn't there? And whether one chooses to go and work more in humanitarian situations or development situations, or leave the conventions of architectural practice proper, I mean, they're all possibilities, but in the end, what we want, or what I believe is really missing, is that for the 95% of architects that really stay living and working in the conventional construction industry, that it brings on a humanity that we're talking about. I mean, Kirtee alluded to it before when we were talking about the impact of COVID. What it has done is make us fundamentally question the way that we're working and what we're even doing. What are we even contributing to? Are we contributing to a better world, better buildings, better outcomes for clients, for families, for children, for hospital patients? I mean, where is the humanitarian, where is the humanity within our discipline? And I think that's the essence of humanitarian architecture. And you can find it in your conventional corporate discipline, or you can also find it by devoting more of your energies to humanitarian or maybe development work as well. So I'd like to kind of establish it more as a broad way on, and kind of relighting this more modernist, emancipatory idea that good buildings, good architects help people and help cities and help society. And that's where the humanitarian aspect is at its most essential within the profession, as opposed to an idea that we leave the profession to do humanitarian architecture. So just to kind of rethink it along that level, I mean, there's a spectrum of what humanitarian architecture and the humanity in architecture can and should be about. Is fundamentally an architecture of responsibility. And we didn't learn a lot about that other than in maybe history classes in architecture school. It does train us to say, okay, you go out there and you be a good project manager, and all you really need to do is apply resources and inputs efficiently, and you'll get the best possible outcome. But it isn't the case. I mean, I know, Esther, I've mentioned one time, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, when I was working in Somalia, and I knew that my ideas of how to work with people and do a project were coming undone. I didn't understand properly how to work with big groups of people, because architects are not really trained for that. It's social workers, it's nurses, it's teachers, it's others. And these skills of working with groups and bringing in the best of those groups to help formulate an approach, that's what architects need to learn. They need to unlearn how to be a project manager in order to be a better humanitarian and a better architect.
Thank you, Brett. And I think that's a profound point to wrap up the sort of, we'll invite the panelists back into the next 15 minutes of the Q&A. But Brett leaving us with this idea, profound really idea of an architecture of humanity and an architecture of responsibility. And gee, I wish I'd learned more about it. So I'm now going to segue into some of these great questions. Now, look, we're not going to cover all of the questions, so apologies in advance. But as I said, some of us are extremely early, some of us are extremely late, some of us have to go back to work. So I'm just cognizant of all the sort of myriad of pressures that we have in a global forum such as this. Some of you have very interesting comments. I hope that you're pursuing them in a PhD right now. If not, you should be, or you should be writing a book, because some of them are mini PhDs and they're really provocative and fantastic comments here, especially from Luca, Tom, and Lisa. But I just want to sort of tackle a couple of these here. So we've got from Tom, which I might hand over to Sandra, how humanitarian actions mainly take shape after the crisis happened. However, acting at risks level pre-disaster seems to be essential. Therefore, how could architects undertake actions and empower communities upstream, or perhaps better equip in the mitigation stage? Sandra, have you got any thoughts here, or anyone else who wants to chip in?
Thank you. Sorry, I was reading. Tom had two questions, I think. I was
He's
reading
definitely doing a PhD.
He must be doing something out there. Architects undertake actions to empower communities upstream. Absolutely. I mean, this is not just about the post-disaster. I mean, we're doing huge efforts, and I would say that half of my time is definitely spent on working with communities prior to disaster to understand the risks and vulnerabilities of the built environment. So that's where this part of understanding processes is at least as important as, we say, the product at the end. So what we're trying to do to empower communities, to give you an example, as architects, is also really to make sure that there is a way to dissect and understand the risks of the built environment. Would it be in areas that are affected by floods regularly, the cyclic, the everyday disasters, as we call them? So communities, the fire outbreak in Cox's Bazar now in a camp, I mean, how predictable is that? Of course, there's things that we could do to make sure that not only we are prepared, but we prepare people to understand those risks. And that goes with the along of something which is called action planning. And I think myself learned it in the books, read it from Kirtee Shah 30 years ago, how India is doing community action planning, and just pick those great ideas and translate those in the work that we're doing with communities, and ultimately coming up with plans that are their plans. They're not ours. They're plans that look at joint decision making, at stronger analysis with maybe even scientific evidence of the impact of some of those risks, and come up with, drive that process towards actions that can be implemented by the community, with community, or with the resources that can be coming from different entities. We don't have to cover it all. That's always my motto. Is also, it has to be jointly done with the local authorities. And these days, even small action can be, done with crowdfunded and crowdsourced information, which is definitely fascinating. So yeah, the risk level, pre-disaster understanding, and with the amount of information, the wealth of information we have these days coming from our scientific counterparts, I think it has never been as important now to take up that information and put that into our work in favor of communities and making those safer. Thank you for the question, Tom, anyhow. And over to any colleague that want to complement this.
So now I'm just going to go to Hinda. Sorry if I've not pronounced this correctly, Hinda Rezgi's question. I'm just going to the more direct questions here. After graduating, should we start working directly in the humanitarian field or get more experiences in offices? Because it's not included in our architectural education. And I might just add a comment here, because we get this question a lot in the students in the MOD degree, or the Master of Disaster Design and Development degree at RMIT. And my answer always is, but I'll also segue to Brett on this. My best advice is that you, after you graduate, become proficient as a professional, as an architect, as a landscape architect, as an engineer, or as a program manager. Become proficient in those skills first, before you, it's not to say you can't do volunteer work, but unfortunately, the last thing that the disaster field needs is inexperienced architects or professionals, or people who want to feel it's their time to sort of grow or experiment. But I'd like to hand this question over to Brett, because I'm sure he gets sort of a lot of these questions in his mailbox every week. Brett, maybe to Hinda's question here.
Sure. Thanks, Esther. No, I think that you've hit the nail on the head, really. We've had a lot of discussions with students, and certainly in my role co-leading the Global Shelter Cluster for UNHCR with IFRC, we reach out to practitioners, to others that want to make headway into the humanitarian system. There is not so much a straightforward pathway. It's a combination of, actually, as you said, making sure that people have something to offer. So for those that are recent graduates, you need to know the basics of how to run a project, how to manage the finances, how a building goes together, and different buildings with different kinds of materials, let's say, as a basic. But underneath that, you need to have not just an interest, but let's say a burning desire to be able to work with people in a vastly different way than what the conventions of the profession really establish you to do. So there's some in the chat and some in the discussion here around, let's say, the limitations of both architectural education and the profession. And if one has, you know, really a burning passion that they want to work sometimes on the edge of that or even outside it, I mean, I think you have to be prepared to work in a vastly different way. Now, given that, there are a lot of organizations out there that do take on volunteers, but volunteers that have something to offer and something that meets a need. And I certainly did that in the beginning as well. And I think it was really, really worthwhile. And volunteerism and encouraging volunteerism is a really important thing. There's a lot to be gained for it, because those communities that need us the most and where the biggest impacts can be made are those that are least able to afford the professional services. So we need to work in a different way that is somehow de-linked from the profit margin, at least in some senses. Apart from that, you know, there are websites out there like, you know, Relief Web and many others. There are organizations like Jane's and many of the ones that we all work for that do take on people in different countries, in different roles. So you've got to kind of keep your eyes peeled. I often say, you know, we don't need the best architect or the best engineer in the world. We just need people that know how to work with ambiguity and know how to work in a really kind of cross-disciplinary way, in an inclusive way. I'm not encouraging everyone to go and, you know, live in a village in Africa for 12 months unless they really, really want to. And if they do want to, it'll be an amazing experience, and I'm sure they'll learn a lot from it, and it will, you know, really create a direction. But you need not have to do that. There are other pathways, and there are short-term opportunities as well. So it's really just about keeping your eyes peeled and looking out there amongst all these established opportunities. And a lot of online research and reaching out to people like all of us online and many others too.
Thank you, Brett. And related to that question, Haley's question was, should we strive to become registered before we seek this sector more seriously? My suggestion is, again, I think you're meaning registered as an architect. If so, my advice would be definitely yes. Others might have comments on that. We'll come back to that later. But I'd like to, before we begin to sort of wrap up in the next 5 minutes, refer Bashabi Dasgupta's comments to Kirtee. Bashabi, I understand you're an architect with a lot of experience already, but you'd like to work with urban poor settlements and communities in India. So, Kirtee, do you have a brief answer to this great question? Are you there, Kirtee? Okay, we'll bring in Kirtee. Jane.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Yes, we can hear you. Yeah. So, did you hear the question?
I think what more or less, I think. What I'm trying to say is this, that architecture profession is a very noble profession. No one can deny it. It is that it's a medium to serve the people, also to serve environment. But the way it is practiced for the last several decades, I think it requires a major change as a profession. And I say this time and again, I say, look, it needs to move from monument to people, from magazine pages to practical lives, from elite to common people, from big to small, from top to bottom, from pedestal to the ground. And I think this is a very important thing. And if this changes, a lot will change. And I think that change will require from education, the way practice happens, the way we deal with issues, and we engage with them. Second thing that I wanted to say is this, and this is something that I go on talking to people, that it will be wonderful. Life is very long. And I believe and tell people that maybe it's very important that people put 2 years of this life in this kind of work, whether you call it humanitarian architecture, community architecture, I think, grassroots work, whichever you want to say that. The reason is this, that if you consider this as an investment in life, because it changes you, makes you a better person, it makes you a better professional, makes you a better kind of citizen. And there are a large number of opportunity in a country like India. As I said earlier, it is not only a disaster, everyday life in terms of how you address issues and problems. There is so much to be done. And very fact that you could contribute, very fact that in the process you grow, and very fact that it could lead to some kind of change, I think opens up the field dramatically. And I think this needs to happen, and this needs to happen, I think, more meaningfully.
Thank you, Kirtee. Now, before I wrap up, I'd just like to, Eric and Jane, I haven't referred any questions directly to you, but any sort of last thoughts before we sort of wrap up this session on humanitarian architecture, on advice for the people who are tuned in tonight? So maybe first to Eric and then to Jane.
Oh, wow. That's advice.
One piece of profound advice, Eric.
One piece of profound advice. I would say take it a step at a time. I think that, a career in humanitarian architecture depends on an openness, a sort of broad foundation of skills and that sort of thing, and perhaps trying to weave together some of the questions about, should I get registered? Should I get licensed? It's a good thing to know things before you go and try and help people. It's a good thing to be of use. So if you want to be a humanitarian architect, an emergency architect, and that requires you to spend a year or 2 or 3 in commercial practice, or another year in a graduate school program or something like that, don't worry, the humanitarian crisis will still be there. We're not going to solve them in the time it takes you to do that. So every sort of investment that you make is money in the bank. I mean, not literally, but quite the opposite, actually. But it's actually, things that you're actually doing to prepare yourself for that eventual career. I spent 5 years in commercial practice. I went to graduate school. I have 3 master's degrees. I spent 10 years kind of like building myself into the person that eventually became useful in the field. So, think about it over the long term. And I know there's a strong, passionate desire to get out there and get in the field, and that's to your credit. But prepare yourself adequately, and you'll do much more good when you get there.
And finally, Jane.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was building on something that Brett said, which is that sometimes you don't actually, you need to have all those, practical skills, you need to be registered, you need to have worked on site, all those things to make you useful. But sometimes I think the qualities that make you much better in the field are really things like resilience, a sense of humor, patience, an ability to roll with the punches. And I think those kind of personal qualities, along with your professional qualities, probably will stand you in really good stead. And I think those are the things that will allow you to kind of continue in this field, probably. If you're rigid and you have a certain way of approaching things, I think that, you're not going to survive. But I think you really need that kind of humor, flexibility, and ability to adapt.
Thank you, Jane. What great comments to end up our session on. So I'd like to thank the panelists tonight, Kirtee, Jane, Sandra, Brett, and Eric, for a really stimulating conversation here. I apologize to not be able to answer a lot of the comments that are on the screen, but super interesting. Now, before we go, I'd like to remind you that tomorrow night we have the second webinar in this series led by Sandra, who you've heard from tonight, on shelter protection and gender, and 6 stories of female architects designing for women and children. I know the architects will actually be showing their slides. They'll be showing projects. And I think it's an incredibly topical time to address these profound questions of protection and gender that have obviously just been sort of expanded, but also obliterated through the advent of the pandemic. So finally, again, a big thank you to INHAF and to Kirtee for putting up with me and all of my emails, and to everyone out there who's attended this session, whatever time you are tonight. Namaste, thank you. Please feel free to contact me above through RMIT, and I'm very happy to filter questions back to the rest of the panel. If you have further questions, I think we've had such a range of experiences and stories here that don't just show that there's one path towards humanitarian architecture, that is even questioned whether humanitarian architecture is the right wording. So thank you again. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Namaste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
And it's been lovely
Thanks,
meeting
everyone.
you all ours.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bonsoir.
Thank you, Professor Charlesworth, and thank you everyone on the panel, Sandra, Jane, Brad, Eric. Many, many thanks. And of course, I must thank my colleague, Ankishan and Radhika and Shimul and Erika for putting this together. It was a remarkable, very, very useful. We look forward, Sandra, to you and your team tomorrow. I think it's wonderful. I think having everyone here is a very learning experience. And Professor Charlesworth, thank you very much for help in putting this together, getting this wonderful panel organized. And I think being after us in terms of how to do it and how well to do it. So thank you very much. That's what's very useful. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks.